Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined today. My name is Amy Batson, and I'm the Executive Director of Women Lift Health. Thank you so much for joining us for our 5th Virtual Speaker Series event. Today, we'll hear from 2 women at the forefront of philanthropy about how the field must adapt to more meaningfully take gender and race into account. This is part of a series where we're analyzing the gender and power dynamics at play in health emergencies and in health more broadly, speaking with leaders from across the health and development sector. Please visit our website for recordings of our previous events. Some of you may know Women Lift Health, but for those who don't, we're an initiative to advance women's leadership in health through concrete action and partnership at the individual, institutional, and societal levels. We believe fundamentally that global health challenges will not be solved without greater diversity, particularly more women at the decision-making table. I invite attendees to visit our website and follow us on social media for more information about our specific efforts, including the ways we're partnering with organizations and leaders around the world to support the advancement of talented women leaders. So today's topic, reimagining philanthropy with women leaders. Philanthropy is a major force in global health and development, with the potential to be more nimble and more innovative than many other funding sources in terms of how it responds to health challenges and emergencies. What gets funded, who gets funded, and how that funding is packaged and provided has ripple effects on the priorities in the health field, the actions that are taken, and the voices that we hear from. These decisions are also impacted by who within the philanthropic organizations are making the decisions. More often than not, the people in these positions do not reflect the diversity on the ground where the projects are being implemented. In recent years, gender equality has taken center stage, and philanthropists are increasingly paying heed to the needs and voices of women and girls and gender more broadly. Many are recognizing that a gender lens goes beyond the traditional focus areas. Now, philanthropists are thinking about how gender impacts other issues, how it impacts the grant-making process, and even how it impacts diversity within their own staff. But there's a long way to go. In this space, power and privilege often go hand in hand with access to funding. Grants for initiative led by women, notably women of color, made up less than 1% of funding in the US in 2016. And leadership and boards in the philanthropic space still overrepresent white men and underrepresent women and people of color. In fact, the most recent Global Health 50/50 report, which tracks how close global health organizations are to reaching gender parity, found, for example, that none of the philanthropies included in the report have board diversity policies. Of course, diversity and inclusion in grant making extends beyond gender, and recognizing that is more important than ever. COVID-19 is an acute reminder of the intersections between gender and race and the drivers of inequality and privileges, and of course, health. In the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement has underscored how critical it is for any of us working on gender issues to affirm that gender equality cannot be achieved without racial equality. And more than just affirming, to act on this. So today, as the world adapts to new and urgent demands under COVID-19, I'm looking forward to a frank conversation about the ways that philanthropy can and must reimagine its role in supporting equality, from evaluating old frameworks about who and what they fund, to exploring power structures within philanthropies themselves. Before introducing our speakers, just a few housekeeping rules. Please do send us your questions through the chat function. We'll be collecting them throughout the session, and I will pose them to the speakers during the Q&A session at the end. We will record and make available this session through our website and social channels. And finally, if you don't already, please follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @WomenLiftHealth, and feel free to tag us with additional questions and comments about today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers today. I'm delighted to welcome LaTanya Mapp-Frett, who is the President and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, Prior to her appointment, LaTanya was the executive director of Planned Parenthood Global and has served in positions in UNICEF and USAID. LaTanya, thank you so much for being here today. I'm also delighted to introduce Connie Collingsworth, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Connie also serves as the co-chair of the board of Women's World Banking and has extensive nonprofit governance experience. Connie, thank you so much for joining us today. Unfortunately, Sanate Fasiha had an urgent conflict, but sends her deepest apologies for not being able to join our conversation and looks forward to speaking with us at another time. So to kick it off, Connie, the Gates Foundation has been a long-standing funder in the family planning space and on many other issues that are very squarely in the women's health domain. But in recent years, you've also significantly increased your attention to gender equality. What has that evolution looked like from inside the foundation?
It has really been a fun thing to watch and be part of. I've been at the foundation over 18 years, and so that gives me that special ability to answer that question, because we really have been working always to make all lives have equal value, to give everyone an opportunity for a healthy, productive life. But as you said, those generic phrases maybe were great, but didn't get to what we really wanted, was the ultimate beneficiary that needed that help, because sometimes we really weren't intentional enough about how to design the products or the grants or the services so that women who can be disproportionately impacted in so many ways with respect to health and economy, education, weren't getting the benefits of our programs. And so we realized, a lot with the credit of Melinda, causing us to focus, use her voice, asking questions. And it's an example in itself of having a strong female leader at the table saying, what does this do relative to women? And we have really learned and grown, particularly I'd say over the last 5 years, so that we are asking those questions across the whole foundation, not just at the top. And we are also really starting to do things with respect to data and other tools, which we can talk about more soon. But it has really made a difference already in areas that we give and have been giving, such as sanitation, financial services, as well as the traditional programs of maternal child health and family planning.
It's exciting. And certainly having Melinda's voice added into the world is really bringing an amplifying effect, not just within the foundation, but I think across the world. LaTanya, even with the growing attention to gender in the philanthropic space, organizations working to address issues that focus on women, especially at the grassroots level, are severely underfunded. In 2019, a report on philanthropy in the US showed that just 1.6% of all giving went to organizations dedicated to women and girls. How do you explain this?
It's hard to explain. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be with you today. You know, some of what we've seen over the years really focuses, these both institutional funders as well as individual donors, sort of counting widgets. I just read an article a week or so ago about, intellectualizing sort of how we fund grassroots organizations and hence women's organizations in the field. And in addition to that, responding really to symptoms of inequality and inequity, as opposed to addressing the root causes through the funding and sort of looking at the long-term aspects of it. I've often seen, even in my own time, that, typically there's this favoring of more sexy projects presented by people that look like us, talk like us, think like us, and probably went to school with us, and so there's that, that comfort level and being able to work directly with people who sort of speak in the same language, for lack of a better way of putting it. And that's why I probably mentioned earlier about Ann Firth Murray, who's at Stanford University now, is the founder of Global Fund for Women. It's the exact reason that she started this feminist funds. And feminist funds since that time, I guess we're almost 35 years old, It's been an increasing number of feminist funds, both regional feminist funds as well as national feminist funds, to address this very issue. And so what you'll see with organizations like Global Fund for Women, we feel like organizations led by women for women are actually incredibly crucial to reach marginalized communities and to resource these national movements and these grassroots organizations who are trying to make long-term systemic change. And what we found is that you have to, as funders, be flexible. You have to be sustainable. You have to look at the sustainable outcomes, and then you have to build mutual trust and accountability with partners around the world. And this is the whole sort of makeup of a feminist fund, to seek power from the ground up. And that's contrasted with some of the work that we've done, over the years around gender mainstreaming, where much of the funding, particular bilateral funding, is moved towards spaces that are not gender equal, and rarely has a rights-based approach to it. And so that is, for me, what we're seeing is this sort of need to let go of the way that we traditionally have done things and move into a space where maybe it's not as comfortable, but has better outcomes and much more sustainable long-term results. And, we talk about feminist movements. We saw work that you probably know Laurel Wilden, because I know, Connie, you guys are funding that work, the research that she's doing to look at what social movements have done over the years. And Global Fund for Women is working with her to see how social movements has transformed social change. And what we've seen is that over the last 50 years, women's movements have led to more fair workplace regulations, more equitable land rights around the world, better access to financial institutions, expanded legal protections for domestic workers, as well as protection from sexual harassment in the workplace and at the homes. But yet, as you've noted, movements are underfunded, and access to resources and that kind of support is going to have to be strengthened if we want to sustain the real grassroots organizing that's happening right now in this country and in other countries to make real change.
Thank you. So I want to try and unpack some of these kind of big issues that both of you have laid out. Certainly COVID-19 has been kind of a stark example around how a health issue that is seemingly unrelated to gender can actually play out along the gender lines in very, very profound ways. And it's a reminder that funding for any health issue needs to take this gender lens. So both of you have highlighted this issue, this gender intentional lens. And Connie, kind of starting with you, at the foundation, and both sort of with your knowledge of the broader philanthropic space, what does gender intentional mean?
It means what the word says. It's actually thinking proactively, intentionally about what you're trying to achieve and how you achieve it in the most efficient, smartest way, by designing the product for the beneficiaries and also measuring what you're trying to achieve and then collecting the data to make sure you're really reaching those goals. So we've had a situation where the foundation had disparate investment systems. And one of the things we've been working for the last 3.5 years on is a new integrated enterprise-wide system that we're calling Invest, that really gives us the data with all our dollars that we are giving both through contracts and grants. And part of building that system included a new set of data on gender lens to track which grants really do have impact on women, how are they impacting women, so that we can measure ourselves and hold ourselves accountable. A lot of the focus from the donor side has been asking the grantees what they're doing, instead of asking ourselves whether when we gave the grant in the first place, we were smart about making sure that the beneficiaries we wanted to ultimately benefit would receive the kind of lift that we're hoping for. And so just that simple fact of the reality, we didn't have a system ourselves to hold ourselves accountable. Now we do, and it's been scaled this year. And we have more data available at our fingertips as a result of the coding that each program officer now has the opportunity to put in to develop the metadata that we need. And so we're super excited about the way that will change our thinking, because we'll be informed about those results, as well as asking ourselves the right questions, even as we give the money to the various organizations that implement the work.
Yeah. Back again to the importance of you are what you measure, right? You pay attention to what you're measuring. Connie, how does that, Latanya, how does Connie's answer kind of resonate with you? Like, do you have another take on it or element to that?
No, I think that's, fundamentally right. I just would start at a point of understanding and calling out, that fundamentally the systems that we're trying to change are broken in many ways. And so I think that we can't just look at sort of the organizations that we fund. We have to fundamentally look at the structures, which are sexist, racist, and, as Connie was saying, unaccountable systems to the marginalized communities that we're trying to reach. And much of it is steeped in violence and rooted in inequality. And so when you start at that basis and understand where you're starting, it helps you understand where we need to go. So it's not the status quo that we're trying to make the change in. It is fundamentally the root causes that we're trying to get at. And so I think I think that's very important, because sometimes often what we'll do is start at the wrong place. And that is the second point that I would make, is around sort of something I called, something that I saw a reporter call solutions privilege. And that is, trying to perceive what the solutions are to the root causes when it really lives outside of our limited view. And then particularly when, who's at the table will even limit your perception of solutions even more. And I think Connie mentioned having Melinda at the table meant that you had a much broader view of what solutions you're looking at. And I would say that for across the board, sort of people of color have to be at the table, men, women. It has to look like what you're trying to get at. And in order to be able to open up your view to what those solutions are that you're holding yourself accountable for.
Yeah,
so, Latanya,
I love this. Oh, sorry.
I'd like to tell a story about that. That was one of my very first encounters with a grantee visit when I started at the foundation. We had funded a group to help with the sterile birthing kit that was needed for rural villages in Africa and India. And it was very simple. It was a sterile knife to cut the umbilical cord, because a large number of children, newborns, were dying of infection or sepsis from having unsterile equipment with respect to the cutting of the umbilical cord. So the Western thought was simple. We just create these little birthing kits and we give them out to these people, and that will be so quick, an easy solution, as Latanya said. And they came back, the grantee, to tell us that it was a total waste of money, because these were the very most remote type of villages that had no access to nurses or facilities or anything. But they came back and said, in particular, this African area that they had been working in had myths that if you cut the umbilical cord with a knife, the child would grow up to be a thief. And so instead, what they did is they taught the mothers to boil the rocks that were used to cut the knife and then to cut the umbilical cord, and that the knife really wasn't what was the issue. It was understanding in that context the local myths and customs. And the Western answer, which seems so simple, really didn't take into account the cultural and other issues that were in existence. And that story has always stuck with me as something to remember and learn from as we think about our work.
Yeah. This concept of sort of the solutions privilege is, I like that term. And I think we start to see it both in Connie's story, and we've also seen it in COVID-19. Where it's had a profound impact on women, and particularly women and girls of color, that was not part of the solution sort of framing, and therefore not part of kind of some of the what was paid attention to and some of the actions taken. And I think it's an acute reminder that there's different facets of inequity and privilege and how they intersect with each other. And most notably, the inequity and privilege associated with gender, with race, with class. So talking a little bit more about how are we more intentional about recognizing and addressing these intersections, and what we need to do to shift the status quo and maybe move away from some of our, solutions privilege approach of having super smart people knowing issues, trying to kind of come up with all the solutions. So LaTanya, one of the challenges is, of course, funding is often shaped, distributed, monitored in silos, especially in the health sector, where different issues in different communities have different lines of funding. And of course, we all know people's lives are much more complex, and what may be siloed in an organization is not siloed in how a person lives it. So as the head of a fund that's focusing on gender equality, how do you think about these intersections with other issues and movements?
Yeah, and thanks, because that is what it boils down to. And Global Fund for Women in nature is expressly intersectional gender justice organization. So it's very difficult for us to see gender justice, racial justice, climate justice, economic justice, reproductive justice any differently across the board. And when we fund an organization, we know that these things are intertwined, and we're, again, combating a structure that works for just a few privileged people, and it doesn't really work for anyone else. And so, I worked through the PEPFAR years, and I saw HIV/AIDS kind of pulled out of the health care structure in many different countries, and the difficulty and challenge that caused when that happened, and particularly for women who had to go get their contraception at one clinic. And these were due to a lot of US policies, quite frankly, connected to their funds, but they had to get contraception at one place and then go and get their retrovirals at another place, and so how that, structure actually weakens community in the time, just frankly, for all of us that are women, especially at home now, knowing, you've got a certain amount of time that you need to get stuff done today, and, and the difficulty that causes for them when we do stuff like that. So what it means for our funding is that we have to fund from the margins to the center, if that makes sense. And so really prioritizing leadership in the community, and those voices, again, at the table, so that we don't miss some of these issues around racial and religious minorities, and that we make sure that all of the aspects, as Connie was mentioning, around culture, around gender, are already a part of what we're working through. We have to fund organizations that lead the change they seek. And so looking to them to dictate what the programming is, as opposed to creating it in the global north and then asking them to conform to it. It sounds simple. It's just not hard. It's just not that easy. A lot of our organizations, particularly larger NGOs, the way that they're made is that the ask is to create a solution and then to take it to the field. And we have been spending now decades trying to reverse that, because we know capacity exists in the community. And this community-led approach is the one that recognizes intersectionality and tailors needs to their communities. And so we have grantees. I know you may be familiar with Odara Instituto de Mulher Negra, which is in Brazil, and it works to support queer women against racial violence, Black queer women specifically. And during this lockdown due to COVID in Brazil, there's been increased policing, and it's also been an opportunity for the state to target these women. And so they've just kind of changed what they're doing right in the midst of it, to try to really double down on looking at that population, supporting and protecting that population. And I just feel like this is what women's orgs do. So their whole mission was one thing, but now they've turned to just, really doing much more community-based work, because the time called for it. It's not something we could have sat here in San Francisco and said, that's what you guys need to do. You guys now need to do X, Y, and Z because of COVID. No, they're coming to us and talking to us much more about what they can do in this time and how we can support them. And so I have more stuff that I want to talk to, but I'll leave it there and then come back to some issues, because intersectionality really is the core and the breadth of what we're trying to talk to. And funders siloing that for communities, I think, has been a source of resisting change and trying to stay with the status quo. So, yeah.
So yeah, fascinating and a huge challenge, because it is the way that we've been kind of structured to date. So Connie, you've had 18 years. I didn't know anyone at the foundation with 18 years. So it's given you a really unique kind of bird's eye view. And also I think your COO position kind of has allowed you to see everything across the foundation. And of course, the foundation's working on a range of health and development issues. How do you think the foundation's thinking about starting to apply this gender or more race intentional lens to grant making in, the non-gender specific program areas where you have some of the brightest, specialists with who have devoted their lives to certain areas, whether it's malaria or education or financial services for the poor? So kind of what's that challenge of bringing this intentionality and this intersectoral approach into these specific health domains?
Well, the word silo applies in a lot of ways to part of the challenges. With even the foundation, we are fairly narrowly focused sometimes on our specific strategy. If it's malaria, what will we do for developing malaria drugs or bed nets or the different solutions, but haven't thought through the answers from a gender lens perspective traditionally. So you are right, we would hire the scientists who understood the disease, who wouldn't necessarily come with that lens of thinking about the impact on women. And we are changing that in a lot of ways with the new group that was created, a whole program team that really serves as an advisor to the rest of the foundation. They've recently created a series of podcasts that all foundation employees are being encouraged to take, as well as gender lens toolkits. They're serving as advisors to all of our different program strategy teams, coming in and looking at their strategies, saying, did you think about this? Would you take a different approach? And so we've got this internal group that is really putting a different perspective on things because they're thinking full time about that issue. And it's supplementing the expertise that we have in these scientific areas. One of the most simple examples is the tradition in global health or health in general, not even to include women in clinical trials. So the drugs that were created weren't even made or dosed properly for women. Yeah. Forget the issues about pregnancy and all the other kinds of things, how much women's bodies are different from a hormonal perspective. And then you didn't have any data as a result about women in the clinical trials. So in COVID right now, we're making a lot of investments. And one of the things we're doing is being very specific about getting disaggregated data both on sex and race. COVID's become a great example of showing that there's different impacts depending upon which sectors are getting the disease in the first place. Those kinds of things were never even measured before. And in still some countries, they're not measuring that information, which gives you no ground to address those differences if you don't know that they're there. So asking these questions, educating all of the foundation employees, providing support, giving resources, creating toolkits, all of those things are things that we've started doing in the last few years that we think will make a big change in the outcomes that we want to achieve, which, if you think of it, we really do know, for example, that the large majority of smallholder farmers in Africa are women, or that the people that really don't have financial access are disproportionately women. But the solutions before weren't specific to those underlying issues about women's needs. And that's the shift that's been happening along the same lines as LaTanya was talking about. You have to think differently about those approaches.
Well, Connie, I'd love you to share a story that you shared with me about how the foundation's financial services team for the poor recently had one of those big aha moments as they explored this out and had the data to sort of really test out the theories. But when they were analyzing the impact of some significant investments to expand access to financial services, where their primary goal was actually about equality and increasing women's access to financial services. So can you share that story, what happened and what they learned?
We've got some really powerful data that shows, even though we've been working in this area for a number of years, thinking we were helping women, the data now shows that even though there was an increase in access, that the gap between women and men, which was around 9%, even in the lowest access groups, had remained constant. And the reason is that because, as in most things in life, those with power are the ones who also have access. So in India, what we saw was that the government had done something where they gave women unique ID numbers, and their personal fingerprints were the ones that were used to get social payments from the agents. And as a result of that, giving them more control and designing a system that made sure the women got the money, their numbers improved dramatically. Whereas in Pakistan, what was done to increase financial access and bank accounts was the men, the head of the household was given a PIN, an ATM card. Well, the women had no access to the ATM and didn't have control over the card itself. And so the numbers didn't change at all, even though they thought when they developed the program that the women would receive the benefits of that initiative. And it's a real classic example of not understanding the cultural dynamic of the family and the patriarchy and the hierarchy, or that the women couldn't get to the ATMs, and stepping back and rethinking those issues has made us approach this whole dilemma of access to financial services in a different way. And that's an area where, as you mentioned, I co-chair the board of Women's World Banking, where I've been on the board for 10 years. And have watched that and had the chance to sit in the field with the women's savings group, watching them use the phones to keep track of their funds and hear their stories about how much before the money wasn't really in their control. And we know that when you give money to women and let them have an income, they use those funds to make sure their children are well fed from a nutritional perspective, to pay the school fees so their children get to school, the investments they make with respect to earning income go back to the family. But if it goes right back to the head of household, and it's traditionally a male, then those trickle down benefits that help all of that society typically aren't achieved.
Yeah, it's fantastic hearing these different stories from different countries and realizing sort of how much this needs, the kind of learning that comes from trying the different things. And but I was really struck with this this kind of the work that this service team the financial services team has done, and that you were highlighting. I think it shows one of these big lessons. When you design and build for everyone, that usually means you're designing and building for men. And it takes a much more deliberate, much more intentional focus specifically on the women in that particular environment to make sure that you're designing and building for women and men.
That's right. We want the men to benefit, but if you just think about the normal customer as the man has been, the women's special needs are not recognized, and you really continue to leave them behind. You may lift the field, but the women aren't really getting the lift you need to reduce the gap.
Right. LaTanya, you were sort of saying intersectionality is at the heart of everything, and it is what needs to be remade, in terms of all of our approaches in the health field and in other development fields. And of course, it's nice, it's easy to compartmentalize things, right? It's nice, it's neat. But can you give us a story or give an example where you've really seen this intersectionality kind of pay off? You highlighted the negative effect in HIV/AIDS. How about a positive one?
Yeah, no, I mean, we don't have to look far. I mean, there's so much going on right now today. We've seen the hashtag Say Our Name, Black Lives Matter, of course. It's just been a series of intersectional, powerful stories that come across that support marginalization, or actually pushes back against marginalization of women, the Me Too. But what I personally have seen over the last 25 years and have done a lot of work on is around reproductive justice. And, and this is a term that was coined really 25 years ago before the Beijing conference by Black women here in the United States. It's been co-opted and it has been, and oftentimes not given credit to folks like Loretta and Monica at Sister Song and so many others who really said, we can't just focus on abortion or contraception because our children are dying, because we can't get into good schools and get education and good jobs. Our housing situation is broken in this country. And that was really one of for me, a living example of intersectionality and how we have to look at the complete story of the circumstances that the communities, particularly marginalized communities, are living within in order to get to a solution that's going to work on that. If for Black women in communities, particularly in the South, we're only focused on that one issue, it would not have addressed, and we would have had many of the outcomes that Connie just talked about happen. We had to look at this as a community in a much larger way. We had to look at how reproductive, the question of reproductive health stretched so much further for us. And still, those issues are quite clear. I mean, even when you look from maternal mortality all the way to the killings, violent killings of Blacks. So there is not an issue, in reproductive justice that does not include all of the things that the community is living through, because it matters. So you go through services, healthcare services that, you have a healthy pregnancy, you get out, but your kid can't get into a good school. You can't live in a community that is free from violence. If you had all of that, by the time they're 17, then they're shot and killed by a police officer. So, it's the whole thing that we have to look at. And when we're talking about solutions, that is what makes the intersectionality solidarity so incredibly powerful. And failing to pay attention to that, as I mentioned with the HIV, creates these silos, and it actually weakens movements. It weakens local movements to do it this way. And so we've seen research. I talked about Laura Weldon's research about social justice movements in general, but we've also now are seeing much more research that shows that multi-issue movements are more successful. They're more likely to use innovative protest strategies when they are being implemented. A much broader community comes to the table than before, and so the power that they have in common means that they're easily able to bat back against opponents for any one issue because they stand together on those issues. So for me, that, the reproductive justice is the really core example. I've actually seen it created by Black women in the South. I've seen it implemented by Black women in the South. And then now I've seen it all over the world as a concept around how you do intersectionality right.
This is great. I think some of these examples, these are the kind of experiences that we have to share more broadly, because they not only form, what we do going forward, what works, but even more importantly, I think it helps us surface the blind spots in some of our current approaches and some of our current programming. And that's key. So Latanya, just following up a bit more on this, that, philanthropists, they make decisions about what they fund, who they fund. And those decisions have the ability to break down or to uphold and reinforce existing power structures. How do you weigh in on that?
So, yeah, it's very important. And we've seen over the last couple of months, some really good work come out. Cheryl Dorsey's article that talked about the research by Echo Green and Bridgespan showed disparities by race in the actual who's getting the funding. But then what was more interesting in one that because I already knew that part, unfortunately, but then it was, talking about who is the leader of the organizations that are getting funded. And so so they talked about that it was persistent that you saw across the board. And they did some examples of organizations here that worked on the same issue, Black male achievement. But if the organization was run by a Black person or a person of color, they received like 45% less than an organization for Black male achievement that was run by a white person. And so, and they showed numbers that were gross, all the way up to 91% smaller in some cases. Going back to we fund people that look like us and think like us. And so even if the issue was the same, people from the community who were leading those organizations were getting far less and more tokenistic amounts from the funding organizations than those that were led by majority cultures. And so, so we look at that. So we've got this double problem of, race in particular, but also gender being a factor in who gets funded, right? But then also that plays into the organizations that are getting funded. Then there's also this sort of splitting between race and gender, like who's running it. Yeah. And so we have to really kind of double down on that from the donor side and make sure that we are looking within, looking at ourselves, quite frankly, and looking at those numbers and trying to suss out, what it really is, and looking across our portfolios and make sure we're not guilty of those very things, that we're not guilty of, and oftentimes co-opting some of the ideas by those organizations, those community-led organizations, and then running with them and then funding majority-led organizations to actually do that work. And we see that a lot. And I've seen that a lot in my experience. And then, and also this, we see this, so the kind of what we're funding, we see a lot of work that's going into research that asks the same questions, what works? And it's interesting because the concept around what works, amazingly really hasn't changed. And who knows what works hasn't really changed. And so I think it's the small amount of funding that we give to local organizations run by members of marginalized communities has got to change. We've got to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with solutions that don't look like the ones that we know or that we learned in our own schooling. And we've got to get comfortable with trusting our grantees and trusting the solutions that they want to try. I mean, think about how many things, I just listened to Connie's story. Think about how many multi-million dollars we spend on things that we think are right anyway, that come from our side of the tracks, I'll say. And let's try to reach out and trust and try and pilot those that come from the community. That come from the very people who we're trying to address the circumstances and the systemic changes that need to happen to have a more equal world.
So I want to make sure we have time to get to the audience questions, because there's a number of them coming in. So just two last questions for each of you that I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to some of these issues of the power dynamics in this space, and how do we ensure that the communities are having the voice and the leadership and the funding that they deserve. So Connie, starting with you, we've talked about what gets funded, who gets funded, how it gets funded, but we haven't talked about some of the internal dynamics within a philanthropy. We know, like the rest of health in the development field, philanthropies have a ways to go to ensure that women, that people of color, people from diverse country backgrounds are adequately represented, especially at the top. And I know there's been some great developments going on in the foundation and in other institutions, but what else needs to happen now? And just picking up on a question I've already seen, and particularly on the race issue, how is the foundation thinking about that?
So the foundation has just made some changes in our leadership team, and we've had a woman leader several times. We've had women on our leadership team, but we have added a number of new people that add additional diversity, as well as two new presidents that one is the replacement for Mark Sussman, our new CEO, And that's a woman, Gargi Ghosh, who will be who's just become the president of our global policy and advocacy team, which is by numbers the largest group in the foundation. We also just in this last week announced the appointment of Nazita Zaire, who was one of the leaders of this particular program, Women Lift Women, as the president of our gender equality. So we had a 2-day retreat this week virtually, and half of the leadership team now is women, and there's much more diversity on the leadership team. I'm a huge believer in the fact that the tone starts at the top, and that those people have admittedly a lot of power and influence. And just sitting at the table gives those people the right to ask questions and to challenge decisions with respect to pay, promotion, with respect to policies. And those have huge trickle down effects throughout the whole org, but also on your whole strategy and approach. So we're consciously working toward those goals, but we have a ways still to go. And I think that one of the challenges is not just internally, but then thinking about, as Latanya was saying, who we fund. Yeah. And around 9 months ago, we hired a new leader for our diversity, equity, and inclusion, Leslie Mays, a fantastic woman who is leading us in our DEI strategy development process. I'm the co-chair of our leadership council, and part of our retreat this week was doing a presentation of the framework. And we have 4 pillars, the first of which I want to emphasize, which is how we change our approach with respect to partnership and voice. And it's dead on to this issue of who we give money to. I think we've done things that we have benefited from. As one example, we formed the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa in partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation over 14 years ago. It is now one of the leading organizations in Africa with respect to smallholder farmers, completely run by African leadership, focused on giving money to local organizations. I took a moment last night to look up and see that they've given away $400 million, over 800 grants to local organizations. But those efforts to build and sustain those local organizations have to be made with intentionality, and they take a while to build that capacity. It won't happen overnight. You have to make those decisions and then follow through. And I think that really the classic line that I've heard over and over again about why there aren't more women on corporate boards, well, we can't find anyone qualified. I think that's the lamest excuse that you could ever give, because you really are, when people are saying that, they're looking in their closed networks as who their definition of qualified is. And we have to give those other people that don't look like the standard, white male or whoever it is, as Latanya was saying, that looks like you or went to school with you. We have to give those people that opportunity and let them sit at the table and have their place. And that's when we'll start to see a lot of change. And it may be a little bit riskier or untried, but that's where philanthropy has a role to play. We aren't held to the same metrics. We don't have the shareholders. That's good and bad from accountability, but it does allow us to be bold and take risks, because not everything will succeed. And that's a great way for us to really learn more and also spread the power, which is a lot of what this is about, is by bringing those other diverse perspectives and leaders and let them have a say in their local community on how things are changed, because they know better oftentimes, as I was describing in my story, than the people sitting, back at the headquarters where money may be really held.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and this idea that, philanthropy does have the ability to be bolder, to take more risk. And so that's exciting. Okay, Latanya, one last question, and then I'm turning to the audience. I'd ask you to keep it short because there's a lot of questions coming in. But just to kind of build on what you've talked about, and I think what Connie has highlighted about the potential for philanthropy to be bolder, to be investing in communities, to be building that capacity. Can you help us think through, what does it look like for philanthropy to use power with, in partnership with, a grantee, versus using that power over a grantee, right? Can you kind of help us separate those two things out, and what it really, how does it change the dynamic? How does it change the way the any foundation is going to be working with, any philanthropy will be working with their grantees?
Look, I mean, I'm at Global Fund for Women, and we're built to do this, and so I'm humbled and I'm honored to be able to be at the helm of the organization where you trust your grantees. So that would be first. And so when you look at a partnership, you have to start that relationship with trust. You cannot come from a colonialistic, racist, sexist sort of frame, which much of us do in the US, unfortunately, in order to have those relationships. You have to think about flexible funding and support for these organizations. It's going to be very difficult for people on the front lines to figure out what's going to happen in 10 months from now and the way that they do things. And so even if you have a plan, you have to be able to support their resilience and their agility when things happen that they need to address in their communities. And oftentimes you're not sitting there, so you don't even know it's happening until they let you know that. And so flexible funding comes with the concept around core funding. Supporting the organization is supporting the work. And so I think we have to revisit it a little bit, because we've gone so far off on that kind of funding, on enabling communities to be able to demand what they need, and not looking at that as if it's some kind of, sacrilegious request, but that is what we are asking them to do. And so we have to allow them to do that. And so, and these are tenets of the Global Fund for Women's, the way that we do things sometimes is as important as what we do. And so I'd encourage all of us as funders to be able to get at these systemic changes, to be able to really look strongly at how we model the way that we fund. And that means a whole lot of stuff that we've been talking about today. So those are the things that I think are crucially important.
That's fantastic. And I think the insights that both of you have been speaking to in this is it's really exciting. And it's highlighting the changes we need to make to address kind of what women and girls are experiencing in their lives, not just in one sort of particular piece, during COVID and very much beyond. As Connie highlighted, philanthropy has helped to shape and sustain kind of global health, and it has this potential to be the risk taker, to be nimble, to be responsive. And this has been critical. We've seen it over and over in what's been established for emergencies, for outbreaks, and how they've been able to cope or not. But we know that structural racism, persistent sexism, and unequal access to funding is continuing to impact health outcomes. And we've heard some of those statistics today. And COVID-19 has been a stark illustration about how that gender and racial equality must be at the heart of philanthropy to create not only a fairer, but also a healthier world. It's exciting to hear how philanthropists are starting to take greater note of this inherent power dynamic that exists within grant making. And we have this opportunity to break down these barriers and, as the saying goes now, build back better. So it's truly an exciting and pivotal moment. So to kick to some of the questions from our audience, to Connie, the question of, isn't now the time to ensure that not just the philanthropy, but the grantee organizations themselves are also diverse in their senior executives and their board constitution as a precondition even of being a grantee, so that we have that whole chain of diversity from the philanthropy to the grantee to the actual communities that they're serving?
Yes, and I think that is another tool that you use when you have the power and leverage of money to ask those kinds of questions and say, who is on your board? Who is your leadership? What is the composition of your teams, not only with respect to grantees, but also with respect to vendors? And so my previous role at the foundation was general counsel, and I'm still the chief legal officer. We have been asking our outside law firms to give us information about who's on the team that does the work. And I've personally had influence over who's getting credit for the fees that we pay, because that goes back to the structural issues. It's fine to have them working, but if you understand how law firms work, the partners are paid based on how much credit they're giving for generating new business or bringing in dollars. And so just having a number of young female associates working on your project really doesn't impact that. So I started asking hard questions about who's getting credit for the work and having influence over how those decisions are being made. That's just one example, but I don't think we should limit ourselves to the grantees. There's all kinds of relationships you have where you can ask those kinds of questions, and should. And people will listen and pay attention to that. And I think that's really what's having an impact on the board front as well. The more transparency, the way institutional shareholders are asking those questions now. I think that's what's having actually even more impact in ways than some of these laws that have been on the books for decades. It's the consumers, it's the stakeholders with money showing that they will have a decision made based on if you give them the answers they want to hear. But someone has to be asking those questions to motivate those people to change.
Right. LaTanya, of everything that needs to happen, what changes in philanthropy do you think would have the most meaningful impact on women and girls?
Wow, that's a
big question.
I'm glad you got that one.
And let me just say I'm living in a moment, as we all are, with COVID-19, with the racial justice issues being called out and highlighted in this country. And the thing that I would say to funders, and the thing that I have to think about is, as well as a fundraiser, as well as a funder, because we do both at Global Fund for Women. I would say that the most important thing is to sort of address these more systemic issues with an immediate response, a mid response, and then the long-term needs of the communities that are really resisting right now and trying to change things for the better. Because I think, so often what happens, and, I was just looking at the Black Panther documentary last night, and so much of the good stuff that came out of that, was because it was funded in the immediate term. But some of those issues, as we saw, the violence against Blacks in the country, were still persisting. I think that we as funders have to really think about our role in not just the immediate response, in the immediate statement, around gender, around race, but also sort of then what's the next step? We have to think about that now. What's next? How do we continue to fund it? How do we continue to work towards the goals? And then the longer term systemic work that needs to happen. I think right now, a lot of people, I saw really great stuff, people like, we're going to fund this, right now. But what I also love is that what we're seeing is people thinking about, well, now how do we get to the next step? And so we heard the guy from Amazon is now giving money to, historically Black colleges and universities. So that goes beyond, right, the need to stop violence by police. It goes now to the education. And then what's the long-term play that we need to really break down this racist structure, this sexist structure that we live in. And so I think the most important thing for funders is going to be able to bring the right people to the table. The how we do it piece, hell of important, but then, also think about your steps in that process. So if you're doing immediate response, wonderful. What's the mid response that you need to get to, sort of the intermediary needs, but then the long-term needs as well.
Great. Connie, time for just, if it's a short answer, one last one I wanted to get in. They're asking kind of to LaTanya's point that they're working inside of a institution, and they want to figure out how can they help get their employers' philanthropy to be more focused on gender and racial, intentional lens in terms of what they're working on. And it's tough. Their leadership isn't reflective of the communities. There's a gap between this person and whose leadership, so their voice isn't heard. Any tips on how to start thinking about, working with employers and getting organizations to be thinking more with this kind of lens?
So I think we've seen a real trend, both from just the fact that there's a large number of white CEOs speaking out, and it is part of making change. If the people of color or Black people are only ones speaking to each other, women only speaking to women's groups, you really aren't addressing the people that hold the power. And so I think there's a real unique opportunity right now, combining with the push towards corporations thinking about environmental and social goals, the ESG movement, the increase in the idea of your brand and reputation being tied to giving to your communities, having more matching gifts programs. I think there's an appetite and an understanding that corporations aren't just about making money anymore. And I think there's a more of an opportunity to leverage and to have access to people who understand that. Maybe through the media group, the communications group is one place I would say to reach out, which people might not have normally thought about, because that's in its crassest terms, partly what's going on. Why not take advantage of it and help them see ways that they can both still be effective and make returns, but like we've seen with women on boards, the statistics show you put more women on boards, the companies make more money because they understand what the consumers actually need. Most men don't know that much traditionally about the consumer products because women's are buying them. So there's ways for this to be a win-win for everyone. And I think we should take advantage of this moment to really educate the people that haven't thought about these things, about how it's actually good for them.
Great. You know, COVID has been so disruptive. Things that nobody thought could ever happen have certainly happened across our economies, across our personal lives, across our society, our communities, and our understanding of the intersectionality and the importance of race, gender, class, how we all come together in the end. I think this has been a fantastic session in terms of kind of really surfacing both these issues and some really important solutions to going forward so that we kind of get out of some of our old frames, which might be this solution privilege framing, into really thinking about some ways to be elevating voices, elevating leadership, and elevating those who actually have the lived experience to be shaping the right solutions and adapting as it goes forward. I want to give the last word to each of you on, asking you, what is your one sentence call to action to philanthropic leaders? So LaTanya, starting with you.
So quickly, I'll just say fund social justice movements. It's important for lasting change. And remember that means there is no gender justice if there's no racial justice. There is no racial justice if there's no economic justice, if there's no climate justice, and there's no reproductive justice. It all goes together. And so support these movements so that they can make this the real system change that we're looking for.
Connie?
The trees of tomorrow are planted today.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for coming and sharing your insights with all of us today.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.